So there I was, in the motorway service centre food hall crying while sitting eating my burger. Was I upset? No. Was I sad? No. But there were lots of people, noise and movement. There were beeps from the food cookers and I'd had a long and overwhelming day. Welcome to the world of Autistic Meltdowns. Hi, I'm Phil and I'm a late diagnosed autistic older adult. In this video, I'm going to go deep into a place that I am not particularly fond of to try to give an honest account of what meltdowns are like for me as a 57-year-old autistic man. To be honest, this is embarrassing and personal, but my hope is by speaking this out loud, other autistic adults may be able to identify and feel less alone. I also hope for this to be useful for friends and family of autistic adults to help understand what is happening in these intense moments and how to offer support in those moments. Something that I don't normally do in these videos but is appropriate here is to give a trigger warning, as we will be discussing concepts like self-harm. Also, and this is important, all autistic people are different and will experience all aspects of autistic life differently. But in particular, meltdowns may look completely different for each person and each situation. And indeed, not every autistic person will even have meltdowns. But it is a common trait, so let's dive in. What better place to start here than with a story about my cat Owen? Actually, sadly, Owen is no longer here, but we will get to that later. Okay, so it was the start of last year and Owen, a very strong-willed, 15-year-old long-haired domestic cat, was not doing too well with his health. As a stray in his early life, he had obviously had a hard time of it, and judging by the shape of his nose and associated scars, had most likely at some point been hit by a car. Added to this was the fact that as a stray in his early life, he had contracted cat flu, which stayed with him for the whole of his life. These factors meant that as a teen cat, he was having great difficulty breathing and reached a point where significant daily medication was needed. Okay, touching cat story. But what the heck has this got to do with meltdowns, you might ask? Well, trying to get pills into a feisty feline is no easy task, especially as the pills involved were large and caused intense vomiting if they did not go down the first time, as was often the case with a writhing furbot. So on a twice daily basis, we had an extreme struggle, often with the result of the pills just being thrown back up and our poor Owen in extreme distress and confusion as to why we were treating him so. Being the one to inflict so much distress on our beautiful fur baby day after day is where the link here begins. The stress and constant overwhelm in an as yet undiagnosed autistic person was the catalyst for a series of extreme meltdowns. The first of these meltdowns were not too bad, maybe a bit of swearing or yelling, of course none of which made Owen's distress any easier, which then led on to a feedback loop of more intense meltdowns as the days progressed. So through this period, I was having these meltdowns daily as the situation spiralled downward. The more this went on, the more intense these meltdowns became. The swearing and yelling were then soon accompanied by various forms of self-harming type actions. Starting with hitting my fist into the brick wall of our dining room. That soon gave way to the action of hitting myself in the head. Unfortunately, as the days wore on and my distress became greater, I started to hit my head harder and harder, looking for objects like brick walls to hit my head against or using my knuckles. Now let's be clear, this is not good. And something has got to give in these situations. And indeed, after many of these head-hitting meltdowns, I reached the point where I felt the change and realised that I had indeed caused myself some more permanent injury as my mind was overcome with ringing. This ringing or tinnitus is often associated with loud noises and hearing damage, but can also be caused by head injuries. And that is the place I found myself on that day, and I knew that I had crossed a line in that moment. So what is an autistic meltdown? A meltdown is an intense, uncontrolled response to sensory or emotional overwhelm. Studies have shown that the autistic brain has neurons that exhibit higher levels of connections compared to neurotypical brains. These extra connections can result in autistic people being more likely to be overwhelmed by sensory and cognitive stimuli in the environment. This overwhelm can lead to one of the basic survival responses, that of fight. In autistic people, this fight response can manifest in the form of a meltdown. A meltdown will look different in different situations and in different people, but may include actions such as crying, screaming, throwing or breaking objects, intense stimming like hand flapping or pacing, clenching of teeth or intense muscle tensing, withdrawing or shutting down. Ah, I hear you say, you mean like a tantrum. Actually, no. Meltdowns are not the same as tantrums. Meltdowns are an uncontrolled response to sensory or emotional overwhelm and not premeditated, whereas tantrums are a controlled behavioural response driven by will. This is typically associated with a child trying to get a particular outcome and will usually stop when the child achieves the desired outcome. Meltdowns usually occur as a result of a build-up of overwhelm over a period of time rather than as a result of a single event. Often it will be a single event at the end of the build-up, however, that triggers the meltdown response. Meltdowns may last for minutes or even hours. So, do all autistic people have meltdowns? Actually, meltdowns are not part of the diagnostic criteria for autism, so no, not all autistic people do have meltdowns. But it is a common experience for many of us. In fact, as meltdowns are often triggered by external stimuli, how common meltdowns are for each individual may be down to the environment in which each autistic person resides and the people around them. What about shutdowns? Are they the same as meltdowns? A few months ago, we had a look at autistic shutdowns and I went through my experience of a recent shutdown event. In that video, we talked a bit about the difference between meltdowns and shutdowns, but they essentially come from the same place of sensory and emotional overwhelm. Sometimes we might even be on the verge of having a meltdown, and in the mental and emotional effort to try and stop it, or at least hold it off, we might trigger a shutdown instead. Both are part of the fight, flight, freeze response triggered in the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that responds to danger or threats. The amygdala is part of the brain's limbic system, which is responsible more generally for our emotional and behavioural responses. Fight is where we stand up against the danger or predator. This is what a meltdown is doing in relation to this primordial behavioural response. Flight is where we run away from the danger. In autistic people, this response is sometimes referred to as eloping. Freeze is where we stay still or play dead so the predator focuses on other prey. This is the shutdown response in autistic people. So what do my meltdowns typically look like? Well, I am not a yeller or screamer, but I do often have the overwhelming desire to break or throw things. As a teenager, there was a tree in the backyard that I would go out and punch, as it had a particularly soft and thick bark. Over time, my parents started to notice that this tree had peculiar damage on it. So I stopped hitting the tree as I did not want anyone to know about this particular side of me. Of course, I had no understanding back then about my autism. As a child, I remember many times trying to break matchbox cars in half during what I now know and understand were meltdowns. As an adult, I've had many meltdowns where I've broken or thrown things. Some examples here include punching my fist through a bedroom door as a younger adult, punching and breaking the windscreen of my car, throwing power tools, throwing mobile phones, or breaking what I was working on when it did not turn out perfectly. My meltdowns might also cause me to tense various muscles in my body to the point where they feel like they're on the verge of tearing. The response that is probably hardest to admit, though, is when meltdowns cause me to physically injure myself. I mentioned my head hitting earlier. This has been something that I've done in these situations for as long as I can remember, but also something that I was very careful that no one else would ever see. Likewise, I've mentioned the fact that I tend to punch objects with my hands. On several occasions, this has, I believe, caused longer-term injury to my hands. In fact, on one occasion, about 15 years ago, I punched the side of a steel trailer and I suspect cracked a bone in my knuckle. I did not go to the doctor about that as I felt ashamed and embarrassed to have damaged myself in this way, but I can still feel the effects of that action in my hand to this day. I've been known to stab myself with pens or pencils in these moments also. Talking more generally, studies have shown that an autistic person causing self-injury or pain in these situations is not about seeking attention or even seeking the physical sensation of pain, but is probably more about seeking a replacement sensation to the emotional distress of the meltdown scenario. The way I describe the relief that hitting my head provides is that it is like a reboot in a computer system crash. Now, to be clear here, these are my experiences and every autistic person will have different responses to meltdowns. Some may self-injure, but others won't. And as we have said earlier, some autistic people don't have meltdowns at all. Whether or not an autistic person experiences meltdowns, or how extreme they might be, does not make that person more or less autistic. A person is either autistic or they are not autistic. There is no such thing as a spectrum of being less autistic at one end and more autistic at the other end. What the autism spectrum actually is relates to the variety of traits and experiences of the autistic person. For a more detailed explanation about autism in general, please refer to my two-part introduction to autism video. So what does this meltdown experience feel like from the inside? Well, the first thing to say here is that for me, the experience can be quite varied depending on the situation and the form the meltdown might take. It can be explosive in some situations. The analogy here is like a rubber band being stretched until it breaks. You feel the build-up, but you are still okay, but then you break. But in other situations, it might be more like a glass jug of water that gets knocked and the bottom falls out, and everything inside just flows out. This type of meltdown for me just leaves me feeling empty and nothing all at once. For me, meltdowns are something I don't want anyone else seeing, and if it happens in the presence of anyone else, it is acutely embarrassing. Typically also, the after effect of having a meltdown is fatigue. So can you stop a meltdown or lessen the effects? The answer to this question is a bit nuanced. As mentioned earlier, a meltdown is an uncontrolled and unplanned event. So by that definition, no, you can't stop a meltdown once it has started. The key to stopping a meltdown, however, is, before it occurs, by removing the triggers that are causing the emotional or sensory overwhelm. Likewise, the autistic person may flee a situation without warning or explanation in this lead-up during the overwhelming situation that will cause a meltdown. This fleeing or eloping is the flight response mentioned earlier. And also, as mentioned earlier, suppressing a meltdown may just trigger a shutdown instead. The fact is that the release needs to come out in some form. It is a necessary physical outcome of the overwhelm that has built up. In terms of lessening the effects, this is something that I'm always conscious of. In fact, after a head-hitting meltdown about 5 years ago, where I think I went close to concussion, I determined I was not going to head-hit during meltdowns anymore. I was successful to a point, but when my state of overwhelm got to the point outlined earlier with Owen the cat, I was unable to keep to that and started head-hitting again. I have again been trying not to head-hit since that time, or at least in those moments grab something soft that will not damage me. This has been partially successful, but the tendency is to compensate by hitting myself harder. Recently in a meltdown, as I wandered past the bathroom, I grabbed a new tube of toothpaste and smacked that over my head, with probably humorous consequences, as the tube split and the toothpaste went everywhere. Yes, you have my permission to laugh at my expense here. Likewise, I am very conscious of not causing further damage to my hands as someone who has also a significant arthritic condition. So you might be wondering how best to help or respond if your autistic friend or family member is experiencing a meltdown. Well, what won't help is telling them to snap out of it or any other judgment or negative comment. Likewise, as the autistic person is already overloaded, any form of complex communication during the meltdown will just overload them further. What can be helpful is giving the autistic person space to isolate away from other people and maybe even focus on one of their special interests if that is at hand. During this time of system overload, our senses are most likely also in overload, so even physical touch might be distressing. As an example, unexpected physical touch at this time might be akin to an electric shock level response. But equally, deep pressure from something like a tight hug might be soothing. So it's very important here to be guided by the autistic person when it comes to physical touch in these moments. If in doubt, ask. The same goes for the other physical senses. It might be the autistic person needs to spend time in a dark and quiet space. But for some, sensory seeking might be what they need. Every autistic person will be different, so allow them to guide you to help them. Both in the lead up to and during the meltdown, the autistic person may have neglected to eat or drink as their whole being has been in a state of overwhelm. So offering some food or drink might be useful. Also, please don't assume a meltdown is a cry for help. This is most definitely not the case, and this attitude is actually a bit patronising towards the autistic person. So returning to my service centre meltdown at the start of the video, what was going on there? Well, as I mentioned, I'd had a long day that had stretched my mental and emotional energy reserves. In fact, I was travelling a long way from home and it had been a challenging several days. At this point, I was at the limit of my emotional capacity. But as I mentioned, I was not sad or unhappy. Walking into a space that was busy and noisy also put an immediate strain on my sensory system. While this in itself for me would not normally produce a meltdown on its own, it was the cumulative effect of my emotional system already being at capacity, followed by this sensory overstimulation. The combination at that time? Meltdown. At this point, I could have just left. But this was quite literally my only chance to eat that evening. So while extremely embarrassing, my thought was actually, I don't give a crap. The key point is that this was an uncontrollable response that my body had to make in that situation. It was in no way emotionally driven or intentional. In fact, as I sat sobbing, I tried to think of what my emotion was at the time. And the answer was I had no idea. I had no overriding emotion. In this iteration of a meltdown, I was actually quite calm. Okay, so that's my take on meltdowns. There are many videos out there that give a better technical overview, but I wanted to just give a more inside view rather than a clinical type description. Actually, the one extra point I do want to make is that many people think meltdowns just happen in autistic children. This misconception can leave autistic adults feeling unseen. I also want to reassure any autistic adults watching that it is okay to have meltdowns as an autistic adult. And as further context here, the tinnitus that was triggered by my head-hitting meltdown event mentioned earlier is still ever present as a constant reminder. If this video has helped you, please like, share, or subscribe for more real lived experiences of autism in adulthood. Until next time, bye.